For 20 years, a man resisted God. He mocked faith, plunged into sin, and strayed completely from the path of truth. But what no one knew is that a woman never stopped fighting for him. She did not raise swords, did not shout, did not force him into anything, but won the hardest battle of all, the battle for a soul. And what happened at the final moment of that war is so remarkable that it forever changed the history of the church. You are about to discover how a mother's tears saved one of the greatest saints of all time, and why this story can also transform your life. Shall we begin? The sun was slowly rising over the vast fields of Tagaste, tinting the horizon with golden and reddish hues. The small town, located in the heart of the Roman province of Numidia, was awakening to the sound of creaking cartwheels on the dirt roads and the first calls of merchants in the central square. The air was hot and dry, carrying the aroma of fertile soil, and incense burned in the temples. It was there, amidst the bustle of the narrow streets and the hills that embraced the town, that Monica was born, a girl whose story would span centuries as a testament to love, faith, and perseverance. Daughter of Christian parents in a world where paganism was still prevalent, Monica grew up surrounded by a faith that shaped every aspect of her life. From a young age, she was taught to revere the one true God, while her friends were initiated into the rituals of ancient Roman deities. The Christian faith was not just a belief in her home, it was a way of life. Prayer before meals, teachings about the importance of humility and patience, charity towards the needy. All of this was part of her daily life, engraving values in her heart that would accompany her throughout her life. But Monica's childhood was not without challenges. In a time when women had a restricted role in society, her fate seemed already sealed from an early age. To learn to manage a household, be a faithful wife, and raise virtuous children. Her parents, zealous and strict, ensured she was educated according to Christian principles, but they also imposed a discipline that at times seemed severe. There was a family tradition that marked the young women of the house, the responsibility of caring for the wine barrels. A simple task, but laden with meaning. It was in this daily practice that Monica faced her first great moral test. On a hot summer afternoon, while helping a servant fill jars with freshly fermented wine, she felt an unexpected temptation. The sweet, woody aromas of the liquid filled her nostrils, and driven by curiosity, she brought the cup to her lips. First, a small sip, then another, and another. Unbeknownst to her, she let herself be carried away by the momentary pleasure until an older servant reprimanded her with a stern look. Shame burned in her chest like live coals. It was a small mistake, a slip that could have gone unnoticed, but Monica never forgot that feeling of guilt. From that day on, she promised herself that she would govern her impulses with the same firmness with which her mother managed the home. This experience taught her a valuable lesson about self-control, a trait that would become her greatest strength in the years to come. As time passed, her dedication to prayer deepened, and her quest for a righteous life became evident to everyone around her. Monica was not just a pious young woman, there was an inner strength in her that set her apart from others. While some girls dreamed of parties and jewelry, she found pleasure in the silence of meditation and in reading the scriptures, even though they were scarce in that region. But her peaceful youth was interrupted by an unexpected announcement. Her parents had decided that she should marry. At that time, marriages were not the result of romantic love, but of family alliances. The man chosen to be her husband was Patricius, a Roman citizen of high standing, respected in the city, but known for his difficult temperament. Monica had no choice. Marriage was the natural destiny of a young woman like her, and her opinion mattered little. Her heart, which had always sought to serve God, now faced a new reality. She would have to submit to a husband who did not share her faith. On the eve of her wedding, as she prepared to leave her parents' house, Monica spent a long time in prayer. The corridors of the house, which had so often echoed with her childhood voice, now felt strange and distant. What awaited her in her new life? Would she have the strength to endure the challenges that would come? She knew that her husband was not an easy man and that her faith would be constantly tested. But even without knowing what the future held for her, she did what she always did in the face of uncertainty. She trusted. She entrusted her destiny into God's hands and promised herself that no matter what happened, she would not let her faith wane. The wedding day arrived with the sun casting golden reflections over the city. The streets were bustling, and the buzz of the event spread among the neighbors. Dressed in her bridal tunic, Monica made her way to her new husband's house, leaving behind the security of childhood and taking the first step on a journey that would transform her forever. The heat of the afternoon slowly dissipated, and the sky turned orange as Monica crossed the threshold of her new home. Patricia's residence was spacious, with robust columns and tapestries hanging from the walls, depicting scenes of hunting and battles. The smell of burning oil from the lamps mixed with the aroma of freshly baked bread coming from the kitchen. Everything there was new to her, but also deeply strange. The home that had once been a safe refuge was now left behind. Your future was within those walls, beside a man you barely knew. Patricius, your husband, was a prominent man in the society of Tagaste. Like most Romans of his standing, he was devoted to pagan gods and understood little of the faith that Monica carried in her heart. His nature was explosive. His words were often harsh. He was a man of habits, accustomed to being served, to being obeyed without question. And Monica, with her sweetness and silent firmness, soon realized she would have a long way to go to find peace within that union. The first years of marriage were marked by daily trials. Patricius was temperamental, impatient, and his outbursts of anger became frequent. When things did not go his way, shouts filled the house, doors were slammed shut, and the dense silence that followed was like a storm lurking. Monica, however, never responded in kind. In her youth, she had learned to tame her own impulses, and now in marriage, that virtue became her greatest weapon. When Patricius became furious, she remained serene. When he hurled harsh words, she responded with gentleness. And although he would never admit it, this demeanor disconcerted him. The other wives in the city commented on Monica's patience with admiration, but also with disbelief. Some asked, "Why don't you react? How can you endure without retorting?" She smiled without justifying herself. She knew that the path she chose was not understood by all, but the answer lay within her. She did not see marriage as a prison, but as a calling to love, not with a sentimental and fragile love, but with a strong love, capable of enduring and transforming. She believed that Patricius was not a bad man, just a man distant from God. And she knew that no harsh word would convince him to change, only her example. The tension between them, however, was not the only burden Monica carried. At that time, a married woman's life was not limited to her husband. The mother-in-law, a strict matriarch with a sharp tongue, also had a dominant presence in the home. From the beginning, she did not hide her disdain for Monica. The young wife was seen as too submissive, too passive. The biting comments became frequent, small provocations that challenged her patience. But Monica never allowed bitterness to take hold of her heart. She knew that the true battle was not against people, but against her own feelings that threatened her peace. Over time, her silent resistance began to bear fruit. Patricius, even without realizing it, started to treat her with more respect. The outbursts of anger still occurred, but they were less frequent. The mother-in-law, once so critical, began to admire her. When she fell ill, it was Monica who took care of her with affection. When there were misunderstandings in the house, it was her presence that brought calm. Without ever raising her voice, without ever imposing her will, Monica won everyone over by the strength of her character. Then came the moment that would change her life forever: the birth of her first child. Little Augustine arrived in the world amid uncertainty, but also hope. The strong cries of the baby echoed through the house, and holding him in her arms for the first time, Monica felt something different. It was not just the joy of being a mother, it was a deep intuition, a silent certainty that this boy would have a grand destiny. But at the same time, something in her heart weighed heavily. How could she raise him in the true faith if his own father rejected that faith? She tried to convince him to allow their son to be baptized, but Patricius refused. For him, it was a meaningless ritual, an unnecessary superstition. Monica, however, did not give up. If she could not baptize him immediately, she could teach him early about the true God. And so she did. While rocking the little one, she murmured prayers. While nursing him, she sang hymns. Her son might have a pagan father, but he would also have a mother who would never stop fighting for his soul. The years passed, and the house that had once been the scene of so many difficulties began to transform. Patricius, once indifferent, began to admire his wife's strength. His mother-in-law, who had once scorned her, now called her daughter. And Monica, who had knelt in prayer so many times, now saw the first signs of change. Her husband was still not a Christian, but he no longer opposed her faith as much. Her son was growing, intelligent and curious, and she saw in him not just a boy, but a promise. However, that was only the beginning of her long journey. The real challenge was yet to come. Augustine was still a child, and Monica could not imagine how much she would have to fight for him in the years to come. But at that stage, a small miracle had already happened within her own home. The certainty that love and patience were stronger than any storm, and with that certainty, she would move forward. Years passed, and Augustine grew with an intelligence that impressed everyone. From a young age, he demonstrated a brilliant mind, an insatiable thirst for knowledge, and a capacity for argumentation that challenged even the wisest in Tagaste. Monica saw in him a special gift, something that went beyond mere childhood curiosity. It was as if every word read and every articulated thought were signs of a grand destiny. But along with this genius, an unsettled, impulsive spirit emerged, driven by the desire to experience everything the world had to offer. She devoted herself fervently to his Christian education, telling him stories from Scripture, teaching him to pray, and guiding him on the importance of virtue. However, as Augustine approached adolescence, a shadow began to form over his soul. The teachings that had once enchanted the boy began to lose strength in the face of the new influences that emerged. His father, Patricius, saw in his son a future of prestige and wealth, and was less concerned about his moral upbringing and more about his academic success. He wanted his son to be a respected speaker, a man who would carve out his place in society, and for that, he invested everything he could in his education. That is how Augustine was sent to study in Medora, a neighboring city with a much superior academic reputation than Tagaste. There was something different in his gaze, a kind of restlessness that Monica recognized immediately. Her son, once gentle and receptive, now seemed distant, immersed in thoughts she could not reach. But the hardest blow was yet to come. Augustine expressed his disdain for the truths she had taught him. He said he did not want to be a Christian just because his mother wanted him to be. There, away from his mother's watchful eyes, he began to be swayed by new ideas and temptations. Fascinated by classical literature, he became enchanted with the epics and tragedies of pagan poets, absorbing their values and philosophies. He began to question everything he had learned in childhood. If the great thinkers of the world did not follow his mother's faith, why should he? When he returned home, he was no longer the same. He questioned the doctrines, mocked the scriptures, and ridiculed those who followed the faith without questioning it. For Monica, it was as if a cold blade pierced her heart. She did not fear losing her son's admiration, but rather losing his soul to a world that seduced him with its false promises. The situation worsened when Patricius, always permissive, decided to send him to Carthage to continue his studies. The city was a center of culture and knowledge, but also a place of excess and vice. For Monica, it was a sentence of pain. Carthage was known for its dissolute life, its endless parties, its theaters filled with immoral plays. Her heart tightened at the thought of her son being swallowed by that world. But she had no choice. On the day of his departure, she tried to persuade him one last time. She touched his hands, looked into his eyes, and pleaded with him not to turn away from God. But Augustine, already consumed by pride and the thirst for freedom, walked away without promising anything. When she saw him disappear on the horizon, an unnamed anguish took hold of her chest. She fell to her knees and wept like never before. During the day, when other women spoke of trivial matters, she remained absorbed. Her heart always turned to the one who was now far away. The news that reached her from Carthage were like knives embedded in her soul. Augustine had not only surrendered to a dissolute life, but had also joined a heretical sect, the Manichaeans, who despised the Christian faith. He had not only abandoned God, but was now fighting against those who believed in him. These were not ordinary tears. They were the tears of a mother who saw her son drifting away from the only truth that could save him. Those who knew her said that after that day, Monica was never the same again. The serene woman became a mother who lived between prayer and weeping. In the silence of the night, her knees touched the cold ground, and she begged God not to let Augustine be lost. Each letter she received from him was laden with intellectual arrogance, words that challenged everything she held sacred. She could have rebelled, she could have given up. But Monica did not know the meaning of giving up. The love she had for her son was greater than any pain he caused her. She took refuge even more in prayer, fasting constantly, begging God in every possible way. Her face became marked by suffering, but also by a faith that knew no barriers. One day, overcome by despair, she sought counsel from a holy bishop, imploring him to speak to her son, to try to rescue him from the darkness. The bishop, knowing Augustine's stubborn nature, refused, saying he was not yet ready to hear the truth. Monica cried but insisted. It was then that the bishop, seeing her pain, looked her in the eyes and said the words that would become the anchor of her hope. "Continue to pray, for it is impossible for a child of so many tears to be lost." This phrase etched itself in her heart like a divine seal. No matter how long it took, no matter how far Augustine was, she would never stop fighting for him. But Augustine did not know this. Far from home, he believed he was free. He did not realize that every night when he lay down after another party, after another day of fiery speeches against the faith, a mother knelt down and devoted her life in supplication for his soul. The journey was just beginning, and the path to redemption would still be long and painful. Monica's home was no longer the same since Augustine left for Carthage. The silence that once brought her peace now weighed like an unbearable absence. Every night, she knelt in the corner of her room and shed silent tears, pleading with God for a sign that her son was not lost forever. But instead of news that would bring relief, what reached her were rumors that deepened her anguish even more. Carthage was a bright and dangerous city where young people allowed themselves to be seduced by luxury, philosophical discussions, and the immorality of theaters and endless parties. And Augustine, with his agile mind and restless heart, surrendered himself to that world without reserve. When she learned that her son had become a follower of Manichaeism, Monica felt as if an invisible sword pierced her chest. He had not only rejected the faith she had taught him, but now he was part of a sect that denied everything she considered sacred. Manichaeism offered easy answers to deep questions, dividing the world into absolute good and irredeemable evil, denying freedom and redemption. For Monica, it was an empty doctrine, a lie that blinded hearts. But how could she convince him of that? How could she make him see the truth? For a long time, she avoided any contact with her son, not because of a lack of love, but because she felt he was so hardened that he wouldn't listen to her words. However, even without seeing him, she never stopped praying for him. Her pleas became more intense, her fasts more rigorous. She sought advice from priests, but the answer was always the same. He needs to find his own way. Then, one tearful night, she had a dream. In it, she saw herself walking down a dark road when, in the distance, she spotted a young man standing on a rock illuminated by sunlight. It was Augustine. He was smiling and waving at her, beckoning her to come to him. Monica tried to reach him, but an invisible force held her back. Then, a soft and powerful voice echoed around her. "Where you are, he will also be." She woke up with a start, her heart racing. What did that mean? Convinced that God had sent her a sign, she decided she would not wait any longer. If Augustine wouldn't come back to her, she would go to him. When she shared her plan, many called her foolish. A woman alone, traveling to Carthage, it's too dangerous. But nothing would stop her. Augustine needed her, and she would go wherever necessary. The journey was long and exhausting. The sun blazed down on the dusty road, and each step felt like a challenge. But when she finally arrived in Carthage, her heart raced at the sight of the imposing columns and luxurious buildings of the city. However, it was not the architecture that caught her attention. What impressed her was the commotion. Men and women moved through the streets as if they were always searching for something they never found. Young people gathered in squares, debating ideas and challenging everything considered sacred. Carthage was a city of intellectuals, but also of empty hearts. When she finally found Augustine, her heart broke. He was no longer the boy she had left in Tagaste. His gaze carried a cold arrogance. His tone dripped with contempt. To him, his mother's faith was the stuff of ignorant people, a prison for the weak. He tried to convince her of his new beliefs, arguing that Manichaeism was the true answer to human dilemmas. But Monica did not let herself be shaken. Instead of arguing, she looked him in the eyes and said with a serenity that disarmed him, "I don't need to debate with you, my son. I know that one day the truth will speak louder in your heart." But despite her confidence, she could not convince him to return home. Augustine was determined to follow his own path. Monica, however, did not give up. She stayed in Carthage for a time, trying at least to be nearby, trying to show with her life what she could no longer teach with words. But then came the hardest blow. She learned that Augustine had left without telling her. He had fled to Rome, the city of great speakers, of philosophers, the center of the world, and he had deceived her. He had said he would stay, that he would reflect on her words. But while she trusted in his promise, he had boarded a ship and left. It was the greatest betrayal she had ever suffered. The son she loved, for whom she cried and prayed every day, had left her behind without even saying goodbye. When she received the news, she felt her body sway. She sat by the fountain in a square and allowed herself to cry. But even in that moment of deep pain, she remembered the bishop's words, "It is impossible for a son of so many tears to be lost." If Augustine was fleeing, she would follow in his footsteps. If he was trying to escape her influence, she would reach him. Monica made a decision. She would go to Rome. Her son might have fled from her, but he would not flee from God. The port of Ostia was bustling with activity when Monica disembarked, exhausted from the crossing over the tumultuous sea. The cutting winds blew between the masts of the docked ships, and the smell of salt filled the air, mingling with the odor of freshly caught fish and the hurried merchants shouting to sell their goods. The waiting time had been long, but now she was closer to her son. Rome, the city she feared so much, was finally before her. But upon arriving, Monica discovered that Augustine was no longer there. Once again, he had left without telling her, this time for Milan, drawn by the promise of a prominent position as a rhetoric teacher. His previous flight had already broken Monica's heart, but this new news brought no tears. It brought determination. If it took crossing the entire world to reach her son, she would do it. Without hesitation, she continued her journey northward, facing dangerous roads, the cold of winter and the fatigue of her advanced age. When she arrived in Milan, she found a city different from anything she knew. The grandeur of the columns and temples reflected the power of the empire, but it was the presence of a holy man that made that place special. Bishop Ambrose was admired for his wisdom and eloquence, and many traveled from afar to hear him preach. And it was there, in this new setting, that Monica found Augustine once again. He was still the same sharp-minded man with an unsettled heart, but something was changing within him. If he had previously mocked the Christian faith and prided himself on his adherence to Manichaeism, now his certainties were beginning to crumble. In Milan, he found an adversary worthy of him. St. Ambrose, a master of words, a brilliant thinker, and above all, a man whose faith was neither fragile nor naive. For the first time, Augustine encountered a Christian he could not despise. Monica noticed this change. In the first days, she limited herself to observing, without pressuring him with advice or warnings. She knew that any hasty word could cause him to pull away again. But within her, a hope began to be reborn. He began to attend the sermons of St. Ambrose, sitting among the faithful, absorbing each teaching and, at the same time, asking God that the same words that touched his heart could reach Augustine. The son, in turn, began to visit the cathedral to hear the bishop's sermons. At first, he went out of curiosity, fascinated by Ambrose's oratory talent. But without realizing it, he began to be touched by something deeper. The doctrines he had once ridiculed began to make sense. The doubts that consumed him started to dissipate. However, his heart still resisted. He did not want to admit he was wrong. He did not want to yield to the faith his mother had defended so strongly. Monica closely observed this silent struggle. She knew he was on the brink of a change, but something still prevented him from taking the final step. And this obstacle was not merely intellectual, it was moral. Augustine had spent years living according to his own desires, indulging in worldly pleasures and ambitions. Breaking away from all of this required more than rational persuasion. It demanded a transformation of the soul. Then one night came the decisive moment. Augustine was alone in his garden, consumed by internal conflict. He felt a weight upon him, an invisible battle happening inside his chest. It was then that he heard a child's voice in the distance, as if coming from a neighboring house, singing, "Take up and read, take up and read." He stood up, intrigued. There, nearby, was a volume of scriptures. With trembling hands, he opened it at random and read the words of St. Paul in the letter to the Romans. "Let us reject the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us live decently, as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Rather, clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh." It was as if a light burst forth in his soul. Suddenly, all barriers fell. What his mother had awaited for so many years, what she had pleaded for in countless nights of tears and prayers, was finally happening. Augustine was surrendering to God. The next morning, when Monica saw him, she noticed immediately something in his expression had changed. There was no longer the arrogance of before, nor the weariness of someone fleeing from something they could not conquer. With tear-filled eyes he approached and said, "Mother, I have decided to be baptized." Monica broke down in tears, but this time they were not tears of sadness or pleading. They were tears of joy, of gratitude. Augustine's conversion was one of the most significant moments of his life. Alongside St. Ambrose, he prepared for baptism, deepening his understanding of Christian doctrine and definitively abandoning his old life. And on the night of Easter in the year 387, in the waters of the sacrament, the man who had once been rebellious and arrogant was reborn to faith. Monica watched it all with a heart overflowing. Her son was saved. All her struggles, all her pains, every tear she had shed, every prayer she had murmured over the years, had all been worth it. She did not know, but her mission on earth was coming to an end. The night in Milan was cool, and the gentle breeze coming through the window of the small room carried with it the scent of wet earth after the rain. Monica watched Augustine in silence. He stood by the oil lamp, reading the scriptures with a calm expression she had never seen before. That man, who had once been rebellious and distant, was now a new Augustine. Her son had not only been baptized, but had fully surrendered to God's will. Monica's heart, so often shattered by pain, now overflowed with peace. After years of waiting, of tears, of endless prayers, the miracle was before her eyes. Augustine had renounced his old life, left behind the ambitions of the world, and now desired only to follow the truth. He spoke of returning to Africa, away from the centers of power of the Roman Empire, to live a life of contemplation and service. For Monica, this idea was both sweet and painful. She had always wanted to see him away from the traps of the world, but she knew that this path would mean goodbyes. The decision was made. Augustine and a few of his friends would soon depart for Carthage, and Monica would accompany them. It was the closing of a long journey, and she wished to return to her homeland to see her son follow the path that God had reserved for him. They boarded a ship bound for Ostia, the main port of the empire, where they would wait for the next vessel to Africa. The port city was vibrant, full of sailors, merchants, and travelers from all parts of the known world. But for Monica, none of that mattered. Her heart was fixed on a single thought. God had allowed her to witness her son's conversion. Now everything else was secondary. It was there, in Ostia, that she experienced one of the most sublime moments of her life. One night, she sat with Augustine by the window of the inn where they were staying. The silvery moonlight reflected on the sea, and the silence was only interrupted by the sound of waves gently breaking against the rocks of the dock. Then, mother and son began to talk. They spoke of God, of eternity, of the joy of the saints who live in the divine presence. Monica no longer spoke as a worried mother about her son's fate, but as a soul that was already tasting the sweetness of eternal life. She told Augustine that after everything she had lived, there was nothing left in this world that she desired. "My son, nothing holds me to this earth anymore. Nothing pleases me here. What am I still doing here?" Augustine listened to her, moved. He had spent his life fleeing from that woman's insistent gaze, trying to free himself from her influence, only to discover in the end that it was she who had always been right. Now his heart tightened at the thought of losing her. A few days later, Monica fell ill. The exhaustion from the years and the long journeys took its toll. The fever came without warning, and within days her strength began to wane. But even lying in bed, with short breaths and her gaze turned toward an invisible horizon, she showed no fear. On the contrary, there was an inexplicable peace within her. Augustine's friends, who were traveling with them, tried to cheer her up, saying it would be better to go home, that she would recover better in Africa. But Monica interrupted them with a serene look and said, Bury this body anywhere, without worrying about it. The only thing I ask of you is to remember me before the altar of the Lord, wherever you may be." She was not concerned about her burial. She made no demands about where she should be buried or what honors she should receive. Her only request was that they remember her in their prayers. At that moment, she showed the fullness of her faith. Nothing else mattered to her but being in God's presence. Her last days were marked by serenity. As her body weakened, her spirit seemed to rise higher and higher. There were no complaints, no laments, only gratitude. On the calm morning Monica passed away. The sun was shining outside, and the sounds of the city followed their usual rhythm, as if nothing had changed. But for Augustine, everything had changed. He had spent his life running from her, and now he realized he did not know how to live without her presence. Tears came, but they were not of despair. They were tears of love, of longing, but also of recognition. He knew that the woman who had spent her life in prayer was now where she had always wished to be. Her body was buried right there, in Ostia. He did not return to Tagaste, nor did he have an imposing tomb, but her memory would never be forgotten. Monica was not just Augustine's mother. She was the mother of his conversion, the mother of his faith, the mother of his vocation. And because of her, the world would have one of the greatest saints and doctors of the church. She had fulfilled her mission. And now, she rested in the peace she had always sought. The wind blew gently over the port of Ostia, carrying with it the smell of the sea and the distant echo of the waves crashing against the rocks. Monica's body had been buried there, far from the land where she was born and where she had hoped to live her last days. But her mission had been fulfilled. Her heart had departed this world in peace, for she had seen with her own eyes what she had so often asked for in her prayers. Her son had been reborn to God. Augustine remained silent in the days following his mother's death. He wandered the streets of Ostia aimlessly, as if trying to absorb the emptiness her absence had left. He who had spent his life running from her now found himself lost without her presence. In the silence of his pain, he began to understand something he had never admitted before. His mother had not just been a persistent woman who tried to impose her faith on him. She had been a living sign of God's love, someone who had given her entire existence to rescue his soul. The pain transformed into gratitude. Monica was no longer physically there, but her influence would never leave him. If he had once been arrogant and blind, now he saw clearly. And he decided that he would not let her sacrifice be in vain. Shortly thereafter, Augustine and his friends boarded a ship back to Africa. He was not returning as the ambitious young man who had left years before, but as a transformed man. During the journey, he spent long hours in prayer and reflection. Everything his mother had told him, everything he had rejected in the past, now made sense. Upon arriving in Tagaste, he withdrew to a life of contemplation and study. Monica had always known that her son possessed a brilliant mind, and now that intelligence was at the service of the truth. He began to write, to reflect deeply on the issues that had troubled him for so long. But something even greater awaited him. Years later, he was called to serve as a priest, and later as Bishop of Hippo. It was a mission he had never planned for himself, but now he accepted it with humility. He preached fervently, wrote wisely, and defended the faith with an eloquence that touched even the most resistant. And in every word, in every teaching, there was something of the mother who had never abandoned him. It was in his Confessions, one of the most read works in the history of Christianity, that Augustine immortalized Monica's memory. On every page, he spoke of her not just as his mother, but as an example of love, patience, and total dedication to God. He narrated her tears, her prayers, her tireless struggle, and revealed to the world what he had always known in secret. He was only there as a servant of God because a mother had never given up on him. Time passed, and Augustine became one of the greatest saints and doctors of the Church. His writings shaped Christian theology, his words converted thousands, his name crossed centuries. But alongside his name, his mother's name always remained. Monica did not hold important positions, did not write books, did not speak in public squares, but her faith and her love changed history. And so, the mother who wept for her lost son became the mother of one of the greatest saints of the Church. Her story was not forgotten, her name was honored, and her mission was fulfilled to the end.